Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Why don't we begin with a prayer? The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Creator God, we thank you for the privilege of being members of your body, of working with you for the coming of your kingdom, for the reconciliation of all things. We pray that your Spirit be with us mightily today and as we go forth from here. We ask all of this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, friends, I'm so sorry to hear that Lydia is not feeling well. We had a great conversation a short time ago about the things that you've been discussing in your diocese, and I'm so excited to be with you today. And I thought that we would begin our time this morning by reflecting on the Great Commission, which we find at the end of the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 28. And in verses 18 through 20, it says, "And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" And this has been an important passage for Christians for centuries. For so many years in different iterations and eras of the church, this passage has meant a lot. And I imagine that it meant a lot to those closest friends of Jesus in those last moments of being with him. If you remember, this is something that Jesus is saying to his disciples, those men and women that have spent day and night with him 24/7 for these last 3 years on this epic journey of his ministry. And he's about to leave them. And I'm sure many of you have gone on long trips when you've left loved ones, and you likely remember that as you are leaving those people closest to you, how much it means, those last few words you say to those people that you love so dearly. I remember years ago when I was leaving home to go visit South Africa, and I was going to be there for a few weeks doing some work. And my little girl, I remember those last few moments of saying goodbye to her and making sure she really understood I loved her and that I would miss her. And I think in the same way, these last few words were important to Jesus and his friends, and that they did really mean something to them and had left an imprint upon them. That said, some scholars have offered that the way that we have understood this passage might be a little off from what it was and how it was intended in the original language. So when we hear Jesus' words of saying, "Go and make disciples," it's almost as if we hear it in the English as Jesus saying that we're being commanded into this movement, or he's commanding his followers towards this particular action. And some scholars have said that maybe another way to interpret these first few words is that Jesus was saying, as you go about life, as you go, make disciples. And this subtle difference of interpretation is really important, I think, for us today, because oftentimes as good Episcopalians, we feel a little uncomfortable with that other E word, evangelism. And sometimes that's because of the connotation that it has had with different traditions, or the way that we see that in popular Christian culture, or what we see in the news and in the media about Christians. There are things about this idea of going that often feel coercive, or maybe a commodification of the Christian tradition. And this slight adjustment in how we understand what Jesus' great commissioning is really important, I think, for us and how we are to be Christians in the world today. This idea of, as we go about our lives, make disciples. And Justo Gonzalez, in his epic book, The Story of Christianity, he talks about this idea in the beginning of his book. He says, "The missionary task itself was undertaken not only by Paul and others whose names are known, but also by countless and nameless Christians who went from place to place, taking with them their faith and their witness. Some of these, like Paul, traveled as missionaries impelled by their faith, but mostly these nameless Christians were merchants, slaves, and others who traveled for various reasons, but whose travel provided the opportunity for the expansion of the Christian message. The task of extending the good news of Christ that we have all experienced, and that in our baptismal covenant we commit to conveying to others, of inviting people into Christian community, is not something just for the experts. It was intended to be a part of the lives of ordinary Jesus followers like you and I. And as I said, this is typically called evangelism, a term that we're not always so comfortable with, but maybe it goes back to this idea of mistaking what Jesus is encouraging us to do here. And clearly there are points in the history of the church that when we think about evangelism as, say, colonialism, that make us super uncomfortable, maybe a little icky. And so we want to figure out how to think about how we can share the good news we've experienced in Christ and in our faith communities with others. And one of the ways that I have been talking about this in our diocese, the Diocese of Texas, is thinking more about non-anxious evangelism. How can we kind of take the anxiety out of how we share our faith with those in our lives? So a simple question you may ask in response to that is, well, why evangelism in the first place? What I have found in my 20 years of experience in helping extend church communities, how to start new Christian communities, is that all of the ideas that we have, the programs and the different things that we come up with for mission, can often come across as that next silver bullet, that thing that we can do to fix things, to grow, to bring in the young people, whatever the point of anxiety is in our particular locale. But what I have found is that mission really comes down to this idea of as we go, that we find ways of making mission a part of our practice, that we don't think about mission so much as a project or a program, but we think of mission as a spiritual practice, as a spiritual discipline. So what I want to talk with you a little bit about are what some of those practices might look like. In years past, we've thought about, when we've thought about this Great Commission, we've often thought of the process of becoming a part of Christian community begins with believing the right set of things, behaving a certain way, and then you get to belong. And I wonder if maybe that's intended to be a little bit flipped. That what we need to think about is how might we create space for people to belong? And in that, learn how it is that we behave. Learn by belonging, by being a part of this community, how we kneel and stand, and when somebody up front says something, and then when we respond, and they learn those behaviors because they belong with us. And in that, they learn almost organically that they believe something. I think it's always been a little bit like that, but we've oftentimes created belonging as that last piece, and made it pretty difficult to find our way to that for the outsider to find their way to that. So we have to start with this premise that if our task is to create space of belonging in our lives as a practice, mission starts with this premise that God is at work in the world. That it isn't that we bring God with us out into the world. God is already there. And this is a deeply biblical, from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, this is a deeply biblical concept that the presence of God is hovering over creation, is in the world. That God has created this space and is present in this space, and that our task as followers of Christ is to find out what God is doing in the world and participate in what God is doing in the world. In our diocese, we talk a lot about this word missional, and it gets thrown around a lot in different circles and has become kind of a catchphrase and a handle for certain kinds of conversations. But the men and women, that the theological scholars that really coined that term, it was around this one basic concept that God is at work in the world, and the task of the church is to discern what God is doing in the world, name what God is doing in the world, celebrate that. The colonial idea is that we've got a better God than your God, and we're going to bring that God to you. Our assumption in taking this missional posture is to say, God is at work in the world. So how might we discover what God is doing there? Now, let's pause for a moment and really think about that. I think that's a lot more, that's a lot less anxiety creating. That is a lot easier than thinking that we have to have some sort of expertise, that we need to have this, this one curriculum or what have you. We need to have a certain set of language that we've memorized in order to be Christian in our community, to be Episcopalian in our community. But rather, this less anxious way of assuming that God is at work. You don't have to be anything more than who God has created you. But be present and see where God is at work and join in that work. That seems to me a lot less anxious and assuring that it isn't just up to me, that it is up to God and God's Spirit to do the work. And so how might we do that? That doesn't necessarily mean that we have disciplined ourselves, practiced ourselves into a way of noticing what God is doing in the world. So what I would like to talk with you for briefly here, and then we're going to open it up for some conversation, is what might some of those practices be if mission was to become a spiritual practice and not simply a program or a project, but something that all of us could enter into. The first thing, I think, the clear gospel example of what mission was for Jesus was to befriend the unlikely friend. So who is it in your context, in your daily life, that might be an unlikely friendship? Might not be somebody that would be someone that you would naturally befriend, but nonetheless, you see them with some regularity. It may be that there's nobody. You've got a fairly close routine of people that you feel comfortable with and know well, and maybe that is the boundary that the Spirit is asking you to cross. But who in your life might you extend friendship to? Our God is a boundary crossing God. That is constantly what we see Jesus doing, is including and inviting into the community of Christ those that nobody else assumes that should be a part of that community. And his disciples are constantly scratching their heads in the Gospels, wondering why this person or that person is someone that Jesus is talking to or including. And that is the same posture we want to try to adopt. So that might be a person of a different socioeconomic level or ethnic group. It may be someone older than you or younger than you. It may be somebody that you only have kind of a commercial exchange with, a barista or someone that bags your groceries, or vice versa. Maybe you're the person bagging groceries and it's someone that you regularly see coming into your store. No matter who it is it that might be an unlikely friendship for us to enter into? And then what might we do next? Well, the thing that we see Jesus doing constantly in the Gospels is breaking bread with people. He's constantly sitting down over a meal. I grew up in San Diego, California, and I was listening to a public radio documentary one time of a community organizer in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the people that were talking about this man were mesmerized by how this community organizer had been able to get people from different political parties at the same table to negotiate and compromise and make progress on creating new jobs in his area. And people were fascinated by this, what seemed to be a unique capacity to do this kind of work. And when they asked his son how his father had done this, he kind of said very, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He said he invited him over, people from different political parties, to sit at the same dining table and eat my mom's food. And that was what he would do. If he wanted to make progress on an issue, he would invite a Republican and a Democrat over for dinner to eat his wife's wonderful food. And before you knew it, there was an unlikely friendship that formed and progress was made. This is countercultural in our day and time. I mean, I'm sure you all can think about what we see in the news and the media, yet it is constantly throughout history what Christians have been called to do. And even more so today, it seems to me that that is good news, that there is a different way to be with each other across difference. So what would it look like if you started to invite someone out for a cup of coffee or a simple meal and get to know them? And all the while, the practice, the next practice, so there's unlikely friendships, breaking bread with people, the next action or practice would be listening. We tend to, when we think about evangelism, we often think about what we're saying. And if we're going to take this posture of God at work in the world, then we truly need to be listening and watching. God, what are you doing in this place? What are you doing in the life of this person? And so the practice here is to do probably about 70% of the listening and 30% of the talking. That we're listening to that person or persons that we are breaking bread with and listening to what God might be doing in their lives. And the next practice would be simply being prayerful about that. Being prayerful about what we observe as we put ourselves into situations where we are crossing boundaries and building unlikely friendships. God, what are you doing here? Where are you in this moment? Whether it be in the light or the shadows, where are you, Christ? Where do I need to be paying attention? And then the simple conclusion to this practice is being willing, being brave enough, being willing to risk taking action in response to what we see God showing us to do. That maybe just continuing to do that, of embracing unlikely friendship and breaking bread with folks. It may be to show up in somebody else's community in a meaningful way and not being necessarily the dominant group, but the marginal group in that context. Who knows what God is going to expose to you? But I really believe, in my experience, that it's as simple as this, as adopting mission as spiritual practice, first and foremost. In our diocese, we have to date 67 missional communities, and these are communities that meet in all sorts of different places, from family rooms to nursing homes to gyms and taco shops and all sorts of different places. And in each case, these communities of people have started with someone from our congregation taking this kind of a posture and being willing to cross the boundary into unlikely friendship, listening to those people, seeing where God is at work there, and then responding faithfully to what God is challenging them towards. Sometimes those are no more than groups of people that gather on a regular basis, folks that are from a congregation and gathering with folks that will not or cannot ever participate in a traditional church. Sometimes those end up becoming church plants. They become worshiping communities. Sometimes they just exist for a season. Sometimes they end up becoming groups that work for better street lights in their block or start community gardens. The point is that God is up to stuff in our communities. All sorts of things are happening where God is redeeming and reconciling all things to God's self. The question is will we be brave enough to go meet where God is? And the fruit of that will come in a variety of different ways. But again, with that posture, I believe. And the reason why I think that posture is so important is it ensures that we avoid those different kinds of evangelism that make us feel gross when we see other tribes do it, or we look back at Christian history and we get a little wincy by seeing it happen in coercive or commodifying ways. In this way, it is truly not making our own agendas first and foremost, but making God's agenda first and foremost. It's not belittling the good news down to something that's just simply religious goods and services, but exposing how grand and expansive the good news of God is. So those are the things that we've been working on in our diocese. And Lydia had asked that I make sure to not talk for the entire time, but pause and create some space for conversation between you and I. So why don't I stop there and just check in? Do you have any questions or comments about anything that I've said this morning so far? You haven't had your coffee yet, friends.
Episcopalians, we've all had coffee.
Need some espresso, maybe.
Well, I have a question, Jason. My name is Ellen, and I'm infatuated with or intrigued by missional communities, and wondering if there's a template or if they all look different, and wondering if there are certain components that you find emerging as these communities come together.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great question. There is what I would say, rather than a particular methodology, certain traits that we see across missional communities. And these are traits that we expect, that we anticipate. And the three traits are spiritual, relational, and missional. So the spiritual aspect is that these aren't communities that are just getting together for fellowship. They are certainly relational fellowships, relational groups of people that are of a size and scale that allow for meaningful relationships to be made. But they are not just folks getting together for a book club or to work in a community garden or to do political organizing. They are spiritual communities. And so that means that we can bring the depth and breadth of the Book of Common Prayer to these communities. They might practice evening prayer or morning prayer or noonday prayer or vespers. They may have a Bible study together. They may sing songs, hymns together. And some of them even celebrate the Eucharist together. But the practices that are explicitly Christian practices are expected to be a part of these communities, so that as they develop, people increasingly can share their own Christian journey in their own way. They can articulate what that formation has looked like in that experience. So we are not actually all that specific on what that looks like, but it is a component, no matter what your community looks like, that there is something distinctly Christian about how you gather. And that has made it a precedent for my office to ensure that we are teaching these leaders how to use the Book of Common Prayer in particular. I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church, and I had been a church planner for a number of years when I discovered the Book of Common Prayer. And it was fascinating to me. I grew up from an evangelical environment, and when you are trying to teach people to pray that have never prayed before, it seems to that person that has never prayed before as if you have a whole bunch of prayers memorized when you just pray extemporaneously. And I found it creating a whole lot of anxiety for people that had not been exposed to Christianity before. And when I found the prayer book, I thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is like a handbook for prayer. It's okay if you don't know how to pray. There's a guide right here. You just follow along and it's right there. So we have a whole lot of tools that I think sometimes we've forgotten how useful they are for evangelism and discipleship. So we teach people the depth and breadth of the Book of Common Prayer. As I said, they're relational in that we teach people the best practices for group facilitation, how to do group spiritual direction, so that these are communities that are nurturing healthy relationships, that people learn how to care for each other in these groups. But lastly, one of the dangers of a highly relational group is that it can become inward really easily. And we're all Episcopalians, we're familiar with those kinds of communities. And so it's important that there is always an emphasis that the leaders, whether it's a group of leaders or one leader, always reminds the group that our task is to always be thinking about who is not here yet. Who is God calling us to bless, befriend, partner with, that is not a part of this community? So for some communities, it's a constant prayer when they gather for who is not there yet. Some people, it's that empty chair policy where they always have a chair in the room that's empty on purpose to help them remember that we exist for those that are not here yet. For some, it's part of their regular rhythm is for being out in the community, doing things like laundry love or different works of charity and mercy in their context. But always making a fabric of these communities. Those three traits seems to be what has allowed for the diversity of what these communities look like, but ensuring that they accomplish these these particular characteristics and traits.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you ever find that you just start out maybe offering to buy someone a cup of coffee and then it just morphs into what you're really looking for?
Absolutely. I think that's the thing that has been consistent in my experience of trying to go about this practice. If we go, I mean, think about it in any of the things that we do in our lives. If we go with a posture of willingness to learn and listen, we end up learning something. And so I think that my experience has been, anytime I put myself in a position to listen and to learn from somebody, I do end up learning from that person. Oftentimes it's not what I anticipated, but that's okay. That if I am putting myself in the position of the follower of where Christ is in the world, rather than assuming that I'm ahead of Christ, showing the Spirit of God where the trail is and what needs to be done, then that's okay. That's okay to be the learner in the process and discover what God is doing. You know, one of the things that is a key trait of how our culture works right now from a commercial vantage point is think about the last new restaurant you tried out, or the latest recipe you tried out, or maybe the new product you bought online. I would imagine that for almost all of us, when we did that, we looked at the customer reviews. I call it the Yelp effect. So a lot of folks use Yelp to find new restaurants. Well, Yelp is powered by customer reviews. The only reason why Yelp works is because you go to Yelp, you're looking for a new barbecue place, and you see which of the barbecue restaurants in your locale has had the highest reviews by the most people reviewing it. And you say, that's the place to go. If you're looking at a book on, say, evangelism, you're going to probably go and read the reviews and see which one got the reviews. So our culture is increasingly outsourcing the decision making, or maybe not decisions making so much, but in the approval, the designation of what is good and what is bad. And so therefore, why wouldn't we consider the same kind of posture in our communities, that we go into our communities truly listening to what our communities are observing? I think that a lot of times we assume in our congregations, so not even thinking about how we might start something new, but how we actually continue the work, the faithful work of the congregations that are already established in your diocese. We assume we know what the neighborhood wants or the community wants. But how do we know that unless we kind of use the Yelp effect? How do we know that unless we actually meet some of our neighbors in the community and listen to them and hear how they experience our communities, whether they've come to visit us on Sunday morning or not? And if you can get them to come and visit you on Sunday morning, I would really encourage you to use that same idea of inviting them out for a cup of coffee, and not just the clergy. That creates a bottleneck. For everybody to have an invitation to, I mean, I'm sure that your clergy are the best, schedulers, and they manage their time better than those in the Diocese of Texas. But nonetheless, let's hope for more than one visitor a month. And so we would love it if every member got to participate in this activity of, when somebody new comes along, inviting them out for coffee or breakfast or brunch or whatever, and simply asking them, how did you experience our congregation? What was that like? I did this one time back when I was living in San Diego, and when I got together with this individual and asked them about our service, their one question that was, it was really nice. People were friendly. But the one thing that confused me is, why do you guys all think you did something really wrong? They didn't understand. Some of you caught that. The confession. They didn't understand what the confession was all about. Geez, you guys really screwed up. I mean, you're telling the creator of it, what did you do? And so what an opportunity to talk to that person about confession and about what we really believe Christ has done for us and what God is doing in the world. And that the whole thing about the theodicy of God that communicates is really powerful. And this person had just no clue what that was about. And so thinking about that opportunity to invite ourselves into conversations, we don't know where it's going to take us. But I think it's incredibly important for what new work God might be calling us to, but also for the edification and the strengthening of the work that we're already committed to in our congregations, our brick and mortar places of worship.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason. I think we're going to have to move along here, so.
Yes, we are at the end of our time. Thank you all. Know that we're praying for you in the Diocese of Texas. If there is anything that I can do to be a resource and help to you, please know that you can reach out. Lydia knows how to get a hold of me. I'm pretty easy to find online. And we have a lot of resources at epicenter.org/missional that you are welcome to use. And we try as best as we can to outsource anything we can to make it as easy as possible for people to be on mission in the world. And thank you for caring about this subject. Thank you for wanting to grow. Thank you for caring about your communities. And I'm so glad to be a distant family member of yours. So grace and peace. Have a great Saturday.